Today's webinar is presented by Matt Grasser. He's the Deputy Director of Inclusive FinTech and one of the authors of the report. Let me pass it over to you, Matt. I'm happy to drive if you want to let me know to advance the next slide.
Sure, that sounds good. Thanks, Jane. So yeah, we're here today to discuss the AI report. I think that the purpose of this initial introduction is to go over some high-level concepts from the report and give a bit of food for thought leading into the panel. So I think really an important place to start, and the place we start the report, is to define what artificial intelligence is. So this is a notoriously ambiguous term and kind of a moving target. And so what we're talking about right now, we feel is really important to come to a consensus on before we dive into why and how and all of these other aspects. So yeah, Jane, if you could move forward. So the dictionary definition of artificial intelligence from Merriam-Webster is the capability of a machine to imitate intelligent human behavior. So this brings to mind kind of images like this robot on the right, which I think is from the Terminator series, and the image on the next slide, which is focused on executives kind of standing and watching an artificial intelligence machine mine the data for insights and revenue. Well, they kind of sit and watch it imitate what they may have been doing otherwise. And so we ask, really, is this what AI is in terms of practical applications now? Or whether this is something that is a bit of hype. So Jane, if you could move forward. Yeah, there's the word hype. So we like to kind of tweak that definition just a little bit as we show on the next slide, which is one word different, right? It's not a machine imitating humans and this evil robot vision, but really the capability of a machine to augment existing intelligent human behavior. And so this has a slightly different connotation. It's not just a tool for automatically mining insights, but also a means to effect something more practical. And so the vision that we like to, or the visual that we like to keep in mind is on the next slide, which is a gentleman who lost his arm. He was a tattoo artist and had honed his craft and expertise over many years. And in losing his arm, maybe was looking at being replaced. And so rather than being replaced as an artist, he said, how can I utilize technology to essentially augment these existing skills? So rather than getting, kind of an off-the-shelf prosthetic arm, he put together with some help this mechanical arm that excels specifically at tattoo art. And so rather than his hand cramping up after a 6-hour session, that no longer happens, right? So this is a technology that's used to magnify his ingenuity and his judgment and his craft. And this is sort of how we like to think of AI today. So in other words, AI, when it's used with care, can provide actors and their expert positions with practical superpowers. And so there's a key section of this statement on the next slide, which is highlighted. What does this mean with care? So it's a tool that can provide, reduce pains and increase gains, but what does this with care mean? Well, we think that there's two critical questions to ask. Let's see.
I think that got moved down.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. So with care to us, when you're implementing an AI solution, whether it's machine learning or automation, is about asking the right questions and then taking the right actions. So these are the two high-level statements about what it means to do this with care. In more detail on the next slide, asking the right questions to really start implementing an AI strategy without asking the right questions is akin to kind of saying, I need a hammer and a saw, and I need all of these screws and nails before you even have the blueprint of the house. It's putting the tools before the end goal. It's putting the solution before the problem is even defined. So we recommend starting with, in which environment will this artificial intelligence solution act and for whom? And what specific problem will AI address? So this can be defined through use cases, for example, and persona definitions. So as a loan officer at a financial institution, I want to make sure that I'm giving myself the highest confidence in approving a loan based on past data to give the highest likelihood that it will not default or be at risk after 30 days, for instance. And by starting with the problem, it forces you to evaluate AI against that and other tools for that matter against that problem. So asking the right questions is one key before even getting into exploring AI. The second topic on the next slide is about then taking the right actions. So this is at the other end of the chain. I've asked the right questions. I've decided that based on these questions, artificial intelligence or machine learning is the right way to go. And then taking the right actions based on those predictions is also critical. So making sure we're paying attention to bias. This means bias in the data that's being used to train the model, bias in any heuristics that are being used and incorporated into the solution, and monitoring of the consequences or the actions that are taken based on this model. So particularly the unintended consequences. So if a machine learning model is making a prediction, we need to understand how that feeds back into the real world, and we need to kind of inform our context and update our understanding of the problem statement that we started with and that question that we started with based on the consequences of the predictive model, for instance. So this is an overview of what we see AI is and kind of some of the information surrounding it. And I think that we now have a second poll to conduct.
Yes. So let me just launch the second poll. If you look back to your screens, we have a couple of other questions for you about how you think of AI. So I'll give you a minute to answer those two questions. Okay, I have about 75% of you answering, so I'm going to close the poll now so we can move forward and share the results with you. So a good number of you said you use AI techniques or you don't use AI right now. And also a lot of you said that the most value of AI is automating or reducing the cost of customer service. And then the rest of the response is spread throughout. So it'll be interesting to see, I'm going to stop sharing that, how you think about that afterwards. Great. So let's move on, Matt.
Sure, yeah. So actually the response to that second question ends up with kind of the top of our list for what we have seen through our interviews of service providers and our experience in this space as the kind of top returns on investment for artificial intelligence. So number one is cost savings. So this is really about kind of lowering the cost of manual processes, reducing costly errors that exist in selecting customers to give loans to, for instance, or other sorts of customer segmentation. So savings from better decision making and through automation. The second is somewhat related, but on the other side of the line, which is increasing revenue. So reaching new markets, expanding to new customer segments. And finally, the last is really around kind of product differentiation and the competitive front. So we do see competition in terms of personalization of products, or providing a more seamless experience, or listening to customers when they have complaints or feedback or questions. So really these are the three areas where we see the largest kind of return on investment, not exclusive as we saw from the poll, but kind of the top three that we've experienced. Another way to segment this is really around what types of solutions are out there then. So there's 3 ROI pieces. There's really kind of what we see as 5 categories of, or 5 phases of AI or ML. So these are the columns in this diagram here. So the first column is really about manual processes, something that's executed by humans, things like manual scorecards. I go out to the field and write down on a scorecard or punch into a mobile app some feedback, and that goes into a database somewhere. The second column is automation. So what this means is essentially that the programs don't think or learn on their own, but basically they're able to take a set of instructions and replicate them quickly or many times over in a completely consistent manner. So robotic process automation is a good example of this, where I click record, I download my spreadsheets from a website, I combine them in a way that I need to combine them, I run my analytics and upload back to some other web portal. And then next time I need to do that, I just hit play and it does it all for me again. So this is about that cost reduction and automating manual processes. And from there, we get more into the realm of what people call machine learning. So classical statistics is the foundational portion for machine learning. Things like regression and segmentation, nearest neighbors, these sorts of things fall in that category. And as that progresses, then we move into machine learning, which means essentially like iterative statistics or iterative versions of classical statistics that can learn from new data coming in and update predictions or responses based on that. And this includes tools like deep learning and other neural networks. And finally, to the far right, we have artificial general intelligence, which is really about that initial Merriam-Webster definition, kind of computers or machines replacing humans. And some of these techniques and use cases that we see here do span into there because we see them potentially being able to utilize that space, but are not necessarily there yet. For instance, chatbots can feel like AGI sometimes, but aren't necessarily completely automated or completely generalized behind the scenes. So on the next slide, we see specifically 4 different more common or more advanced use cases for financial services in Africa specifically. And these exist across that spectrum that we just covered in terms of those 5 columns. But we see credit risk assessments as something that's quite mature in terms of, let me use a model to predict whether somebody is likely to be a good candidate for credit or not. Chatbots and conversational interfaces, which involves natural language processing. The third is sort of the sensory aspect of AI, which is machine vision and voice recognition. So helping our smartphones see and hear things that are useful to the customer and reacting to those. And finally, personal financial management. So making suggestions where I might move my money, or making suggestions for how I can kind of climb the finance ladder to better offerings. And on the next slide, we see a detailed view of these kind of different categories. These are the interviewees that were part of the report. I won't go into too much depth here because of time, but if you're interested in reading more about these specific cases and their prevalence in Africa, certainly refer to the report or one of my colleagues or myself for additional information. So on the next slide, we have essentially where we see the frontier of this space existing, some examples and activities that we have done as Fiber and as BFA to kind of test the boundaries of where AI is right now. So within the context of this AI report, we put together an interactive AI experience or a gallery around MSMEs and PAYGO solutions, which was really to give industry players, colleagues of ours from the financial inclusion space, and even visiting dukas and shopkeepers a chance to see what these technologies look like and begin to think, how might this raw technology be useful in my day-to-day? So the goals of this was really to encourage the conversation, to get this conversation going. Oh, I think we lost the slide.
Oh, there you go.
And to highlight, the practical superpowers that we talk about in the report, specifically in these two verticals. So on the next slide, we have a few examples of these.
Sure. Matt, did you want to see the slide with the examples?
Yeah, this one. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
And so this is a few examples. The left two are examples of solutions that could be useful in the pay-as-you-go space. And the right four are examples that could be useful in the small merchant space. So just to pick two examples, the ROI calculator is a solution that allows a pay-as-you-go solar originator to determine whether an intervention is worthwhile in terms of recouping costs or saving a net positive amount. So based on this metric, which customers should I go and intervene with that have a potential to churn versus which customers are likely to churn no matter what the intervention. So this allows me to optimize costs and grow my business and spend the resources on growth and new features rather than sunk costs, for instance. And then the bottom middle, we have an inventory counting app that essentially is an application that recognizes and counts products coming across a small merchant's desk or storefront. And with that count can provide information to potential creditors to say, oh, this merchant is selling 5 products an hour or maybe 50 products a day. And based on that, I may be able to offer a certain amount of credit to them. So these are examples. They're gone into depth again in the report, and in the interest of time, I think we'll move forward. And really, I want to wrap this portion of the presentation up and move into the panel with a discussion of kind of why AI now and some challenges and barriers. So why have we decided to discuss this now? Why does Fiber and BFA as an organization feel that this is the time to discuss this? Well, it's somewhat a similar story with a lot of new technologies. So the cost of adoption and using these tools has become considerably cheaper, while the performance per dollar has really increased as well. None of that would matter if we didn't have the data. And so we're in an era when fintech startups and financial service providers and others in the space are really providing instrumenting their products and collecting kind of unprecedented levels of data. And the data that's in place, in a lot of cases, is sufficient to begin to feed these models where it may not have been previously. As I mentioned earlier, AI and personalization has really become a competitive front. And there is some competition between fintech startups and neobanks and super platforms and traditional financial institutions, and AI can be a differentiator on that front. And finally, consumers are increasingly ready, and some are even expecting tailored solutions. So why is this not reacting to me? Why is it not listening to me? I really want that in my product and in my financial services now. So these are the dimensions of why we're discussing this now. But there do exist on the next slide some challenges and barriers that we have to admit in order for this to become practically useful. The first we already discussed, which is the right question. We have to make sure that we're asking questions that are useful in the world and that can be solved by AI. There are questions you can ask that currently are not suitable for AI to try to solve. We mentioned data, so that is kind of broken down further into format, localization, and quality of data that's available. Capacity, so the right kind of talent and expertise on an FSP's team is quite, a financial service provider's team is quite important to making this a reality. And the last two are often left out of the conversation, which is really the right ecosystem. So regulation is quite important, especially as we see more discussion of regulation around AI. And finally, the right level of customer trust. So AI as a technology has an ability to significantly increase trust by increasing engagement and personalization, but also has the ability to break trust. One mistake can cause somebody to leave a platform, and so this has to be very carefully considered as well. And finally, within the report, we propose an AI readiness framework. So these things all sound cool to me. Where do I start? This diagram here is loosely based on an AI hierarchy of needs, but this is described in more detail in the report itself. Essentially, as we saw in the previous diagram, you need to get your context ready, your understanding of the context ready first, which requires exploring the data, getting an intuition for what the data says, running descriptive analytics and dashboards to understand what's in your data. From there, you can begin to build an insights engine. So get the data together and format it in the way that you need to in order to feed a model. Start with a very simple machine learning model to start, or a very simple automation exercise to start. Learn from that, test, check your assumptions, and test your hypotheses. And finally, when those right questions are answered, and when the right monitoring in terms of bias and feedback are incorporated, then you can look to deploy. So again, this is described in quite a bit more detail in the report, but something worth mentioning here as well. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jane, who will run the panel.
Thank you, Matt. That's great. Really appreciate it, and it was a very complete overview of the report. We have some questions coming in, and I think we can take it throughout the panel. I'd like to introduce you to the panels today. We're really excited to have, along with Matt, Sheil Mott from 500 Startups join us as well. He's the founding partner of 500 Startups FinTech Fund, which invests for financial services for the rest of us. And we also have Andrea Otina, who's the Chief Business Development Officer of Axis Bank Tanzania, and he oversees operations, alternative channels, IT, and marketing for the bank. And finally, we have Dr. Xian Su from Signify Inc., also one of the companies mentioned in the report. And she's been working in big data and AI for over 10 years with expertise in R&D and commercial deployment. So our panelists today, we have a very, very rich discussion ahead, and let me start with some questions. So before we do that, I'd like to hear about one of the first things we asked about in the poll was the skepticism around AI and trying to balance this sense of hype. I'd like to hear from you. Agree or disagree with the following statements. AI is a lot of hype. Let me just unmute you guys.
Well, I certainly disagree with the hype statement. So I think it is it's basically going through a lot of the developer market side. We see a lot of the AI application, the research is already in certain sectors are very mature, and other sectors are definitely on the way for development. So I think it's really a matter of how quickly that is spread over to the different regions and the sectors. That's my view on that.
On my side, as a more of a let's say a traditional banker rather than, although not so traditional, but definitely coming from another perspective, we definitely see the potential for AI, but at this point in time, I tend to partially agree with such statement. I think there is incredible potential, and I see a lot of this in understanding customer behaviors and overall automating a lot of the painful process, particularly in the banking sector, which is famous for having painful processes. But yeah, at this point in time, I still partially agree with such statement.
Yeah, and I would also agree with that statement. Not to say that AI is exclusively a lot of hype, but that there is hype involved right now in terms of the media conversation around the space. And it's one of the reasons that we decided to put this report and webinar together in the first place, is to kind of differentiate between the hype and the practical aspects of this.
Okay. Andrea and Xian, this is for you. Where do you see the most opportunity for AI to impact FSPs, the financial services providers? You can help us also with examples or use cases you've seen.
Well, I think the report summarized pretty well, and so I will step back, and I was been thinking when I look through this. I would say AI. I will use one word to summarize it, is to learn. What is AI? It is to learn, right? And that's why you hear about machine learning and about all of these so much. Now, to learn, and you say to learn what? Then in this industry, it's really about I think the most important things is, one is to learn about the customers. Two is to learn about the market. Three is to learn about ourselves, right? So, and then you say, how do I learn with it? You get information, which is data, right? And then you ask now, what kind of method I'm going to use to learn from it? And that you goes to the predictive modeling, etc., that Matt was talking about earlier. And that's the last question comes, you say, okay, now I learn, and to do what? How do I apply for it? And then where is the biggest opportunity to do that? So I think based on that kind of framework, then there's a lot of areas. First of all is, I think, see a lot of cost reduction. That's about to learn about ourselves for a big part of it, the organization efficiency. And I think that is a very big component. And then about to learn about the customers. So I see the, expanding revenue side. I do believe that's a big opportunity. You learn new customers, you learn about existing customers, and how do we use that to have better products, or even new products, new revenue models, etc. So I think these are, if you go along that line, I think in each of these customer journey and organizational practices, there's quite a few places to apply. But I tend to agree with the top ones that summarized in the report.
And from my perspective, I can briefly say that at Access Bank, for example, we have worked with some sort of automation and AI in the fields of scoring and for credit scoring, and on the area of customer communication with chatbots. And we've worked with partner companies, and we definitely see the opportunity in AI. And to answer your question, Jane, I think the areas where we can still improve is to find better ways to mine our data and automate them and make the whole processes more efficient. And I see three main areas where definitely financial institutions could benefit by applications of artificial intelligence. And for me, these three areas are recovery of credit, that in general for any bank is a very complex and costly process, particularly for us that we operate in developing countries. Another area where I see extreme potential is the development of loyalty programs. So making sure that if you have customers using your channels, these customers stay engaged in using your channels. And ultimately, which is unfortunately something that has not materialized yet, but the old discourse of technology has brought forward a lot, is to actually lower the cost of transactions, and particularly the cost of credit through technology and hopefully through artificial intelligence. So this from, let's say, from a banker's perspective, these are the areas where we see most of the opportunities coming from.
Mm-hmm. So let's go a little bit deeper into that. We have a question from one of the attendees asking you, Xian, as a company that was interviewed in the report, of a walkthrough of the user experience with AI. Is that something that you could describe? We've heard the fintech company, the banking side. What is it like for the user?
Right. Yeah. So definitely. So the user, I would assume this is the end user as a consumer at the end, right? And then for them, for the AI experience, mainly is interacted with a user interface. So either it is a mobile app, or they could have interacted with, in our case, also like SMS, or interact with a web portal. So mainly the interactions through, now there's manual interactions with let's say sales rep, who the sales rep will have a tool to help them, like a web portal to help the sales rep go through, for example, the underwriting process, to make sure that the underwriting process is more automated. Now, our fundamental goal is the end user, their experience is as little that they feel there's AI, as better. So it's not about, for the end user, we feel like you don't really have to brand the AI part, right? Their experience really is need to be seamless, and they say this is great service. Now, what is the power these great service behind? That's the AI. But AI is not the face, it is the brand. So then let's say in the walk through this example, one of our deployments that we are doing, for example, smartphone lending in emerging markets, what the user gets to interact again is with, for example, SMS interactions, that they will get tailored messages to say why this is a good product for you. And or they can interact with the mobile app and then see the product features which is tailored to them. And the tailoring of product tailoring and looking for the right sector of these consumers, the end users, are through AI algorithms. So they've gone through that, and then they go through the application process, where on the other side is doing risk assessment. And that risk assessment, again, is using AI algorithms and data learning algorithms. But from an end user perspective, all he knows or she knows is I'm getting, the service that I wanted. And then when I'm getting the service, I am informed clearly on what are the information, what is my credit score, why am I in this sector, and why this product is the best for me. Do they know there's a machine learning algorithm behind? No, they don't need to know that, right? Because that's not what they care about. They care about their own experience. So so that's really how, and then you go through the rest of it. It's more about servicing these products and services in the later stage, let's say credit offerings, loan offerings, or even cross-sell offerings. And those are more mainly is the AI is helping the organizations who is handling these services to make sure those services are better than that completely manual. So that's more on the...
Matt, you were going to say something.
I think that there is some value in transparency in certain use cases, certainly. Like chatbots, for instance, in terms of customer trust, it's often considered a best practice to say, I am a bot. If you get stuck, let me help you. I think in terms of interpretability of a model for credit, I think it's important to not completely lock people into one space and to allow them to also understand how to jump to a different category. How might I, gather different data from different places, or improve my habits, or change, have some level of control over moving into, I guess, up the ladder, as they say, or into a different segment. So I think there are areas where the AI itself should be surfaced and exposed, or at least made transparent.
That's a very good point. Matt, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I think that's I agree, especially chatbot in those scenarios. Yeah.
Right. We also had the uproar with Google and the demos. A lot of just the response on social media, people were very unhappy to find that someone was conversing and deceived by an AI. Shia, I see you're nodding your head. Yeah. Do you have anything to add there?
So, sorry, is this addressed to me?
I said Sheil. I'm not sure if he froze on my screen.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, no, I'm here. Sorry, I had technical difficulties earlier. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think in Africa, first of all, people are less worried about privacy in general, and people are. I don't think there will necessarily be an uproar for these sorts of things in Africa, but it's funny, like talking about like, not that this is exactly apples to apples, but like the Facebook issues, and thinking about it in a different context, like in Africa, I think people just don't care as much about privacy. It's a different sort of thing. People are much more willing to give up all of their data in exchange for a better financial service. So like all of this AI stuff is actually easier to do in many ways in Africa, unburdened by regulation, and because people are more willing to give up data.
That's a.
Can I add on this comment by Shio, because actually it touches me quite closely, if you don't mind, Jane.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I tend to agree with you, Shio, but at the same time, I also would like to say that unfortunately in these markets, people don't really have a choice, and probably they don't still yet have an understanding of what giving up your data actually means. Not only that, but also the policing capacity of the relevant authorities in this field is completely limited. I mean, it's one of the reasons why certain telecommunications operator in Africa are so profitable is because they are the biggest data bank in the country, and they can basically control the entire market. So I think that at this stage, yes, I agree with you that perhaps people in developing countries, they don't see data, giving up the data as such an important feature, provided that it comes packaged together with a better financial service. But I also still feel that there is a need for better safeguarding regulations in these markets, which at this point in time are actually completely missing.
So Andrea, you get agreement from one of the attendees who's expressed that consumers perhaps don't understand the entire context. I'm quoting literally of data privacy and what it means. In our previous discussion where we were going through some of this content, you also mentioned at the same time there's this trend, or the way we're approaching AI is just see what it can do, see how far it can go. And so how do we balance that? How do we balance the fact that AI is this blue field, this opportunity to unlock a lot of abilities, as Matt discussed, and how do we think about some of the negative consequences of that?
Is the question directed to me or
to you? But I invite everyone else to answer.
Okay. So I'll give a shot first. Well, that's a very good question, and as a matter of fact, I don't know the answer. I think we still have not seen the end of it. I just give you an example. Probably everybody read today the article on the New York Times that once again, I mean, 2 days ago, the New York Times came out saying that Facebook was sharing data with the phone manufacturer, and today came out that actually was sharing data with phone manufacturer, which by the US defense were considered critical for national security. So it seems to me that a lot of this kind of like data protection policies, particularly put forward by private companies such as Facebook or any other of the super mega platform, as you call them, there is this kind of like feeling that they actually empower the customers. But my question is, are the customers really empowered? Because it seems that like we're getting one scandal after another scandal after another scandal. So for me, the best, I think, for example, the GDPR is a great example of a solid and good privacy regulation. And I think it's very welcome because it not only forces within the European Union to have a certain type of data protection, but also forces for any other company or government that is treating data of European citizens to apply the same standards. And we, in fact, as a bank operating in Tanzania with European customers, at times we even consider that. So I think the GDPR is a very good model, and moving forward, I would certainly welcome other governments and other authorities framing regulations in a similar fashion.
Matt, a question for you in relation to the consumer protection. One is, how should companies think about approaching consumer protection? But also some of the examples that you mentioned, it's changing the way we gather and capture data. So how would you map that to the promise and challenges of these applications, like the PAYGO calculator, the product counter? Love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I think first I'd like to kind of echo Shil's comment that there is a need and there is some privilege in saying I can not take this financial service on if I don't like its privacy policy, right? Like that's something that I can say because I have a bank account and I have a credit card, and this new one that comes along, I don't want it unless it agrees with my principles. It's a different story if I'm having to choose, for instance, between whether to pay my top up my phone or pay for my child's school fees. And you can say, yeah, well, there's a demand there and that's the end of it. And we can do the same thing that we did elsewhere and just kind of disrespect privacy. Or we can say, hey, let's learn from our lessons. Let's look at some of the new initiatives that are coming out. GDPR, again, yeah, great example of kind of making sure that transparency and some level of informed consent is available. Maybe lacking a bit in terms of controls after the fact, like how do I turn this off is a very complicated process. But yeah, certainly I think there's a large discussion to be had there that brings differential privacy as a technology, which I think initially came out of Microsoft research, but something that can kind of begin to formalize this discussion into code, into digital code, and split out personally identifiable information from others. But in the meantime, I think a lot of this exists kind of baked into the product features themselves and the instrumentation. And so when we're doing something exciting like looking at churn, we have to make sure that that's tied back to our initial question. So we're taking, for instance, data from a pay-as-you-go portfolio and working with BigML as an online platform to analyze this data and see whether it's worth going out and intervening. But at the same time, like BigML as a platform doesn't need to know who this person is, right? As an individual, they need to understand the behavior of person X. And that behavior can then come back into the platform, and person X can be tied back to, hey, this is the person's address at the PAYGO provider, and they can go do their intervention as somebody who has a relationship with that. So these internal policies, I think, need to be part of the discussion as well, and how products are instrumented and where that data goes needs to be documented well prior to putting these features out.
Can I say something about the data privacy side of things? So I think I agree with the regulatory concerns, and I think the European, the new regulation definitely is something that we all have a lot of high hope on, see if address lots of these things. And then I definitely agree on the transparency side of things. One of the fundamental issues I feel in this issue is, which I don't have an answer, but I have a suggestion for Facebook, for Mr. Zuckerberg, right? I don't know if he's listening, but I think fundamentally what it is using data to make money for a service that's not intended to be. So what does that mean is I love Facebook. I think they have a great product. And what I feel like is if they have a business model, right, they charge for their actual service, which is social media being a friendship network. Not everybody will pay, they will lose users, but that's what their business is. Instead, we are today, the tech industry is using consumers' data with a lot of non-transparent practice, and then having a financial benefit, and of course about this whole data monetization side of things, right? And monetizing the data to sell for other purpose, mainly is for ads. So that's where I see a lot of the issue. If you're looking from economic perspective, it's really back to how do we value the data assets today? And then that's the fundamental part of the AI, right? The data asset eventually is a fundamental part of the AI. And we don't have an answer how data assets is valued yet. Yes. And then who is the beneficiary of that value at the end? And who really should pay for that? If we all agree this is valuable, right? Then, a lot of these are very profoundly, intertwined with the privacy issues.
Yeah.
Great.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to add a comment on what Xian just said, because it's very relevant. And what you just said is completely correct. If you I don't know if you remember, but I mean, everybody remembers this, at the beginning when Facebook was just launched, it was 2006, 2007, and it was only open to university students, right, who were in certain networks. And I remember that basically every consulting company that was approaching Facebook or an investment bank said, okay, this is great, but how are you going to make money out of it? And at the time, the answers was not really clear as it is today, of course. And unfortunately, I see that this is a bit the same approach that, in general, the whole world of artificial intelligence, broadly speaking, and not just speaking in the field of financial applications, is just, okay, let's see how far we can push this, and maybe let's see how we can make it work, how we can make money of it. But in this regard, I tend to side a bit more with the Elon Musk of the kind, whereas it would be better to define, okay, we have potentially this, who could evolve into something great, but let's define the boundary within which we're gonna develop this, rather than just saying, okay, let's try, if it works, fine, if it doesn't work, well, who knows what is gonna happen.
And we're getting some, I think that's a very valid point. We need to think about the big picture implications. And then there are also just the more tangible reality of, dealing and accessing AI. We're getting some questions from the audience, and I'd like to spend some of that time to be able to answer their questions. One is from Gavin asking how accessible AI tech is to African fintech, African banks or fintech companies. Is the tech affordable? And what kind of internal resources do you need? Diana was also asking what local capacity, human capacity, do we need to develop and support AI?
I can have some of my experience, talk from some of my experience here. I think for Africa market, I do think the cost is still quite high. I think it's the starting point for adopting these technologies, and there is a cost component there. And mainly the cost comes from the human resource side of things, and then the lack of local resources. So if you need, ship right talents from a market like US then or UK, then that's fundamentally is driving up the cost there. And then the other cost is that for a lot of computing and technology costs. So in developed markets, you get a very mature cloud computing, for example. And then we today go to, as a company, Signify, we also go to other developing markets. And in certain markets, for example, we got 5 servers, which we can use the same money to get 50 servers in the States. And that's the cost is there. So I think it's still early. And now to say that, I would not completely just say it's not accessible. And we need to think about how, like, what are the few ways. One is, I think my belief is certain things doesn't cost money. For example, some management's, training. Well, it will cost money for training, of course, but it's less right cost. And the really opinions, the education, like the panels that BFA is putting together, like this education and changing people's opinions and incorporate those ideas into management practice. That's number one. Number two is to look back to the local capacity side of things. I think there's, for example, I've seen pretty solid IT capacities in the countries we went briefly, like Uganda, Kenya. I don't know a lot of other countries, but I see solid IT capacities, and those are a foundation to build on top of those. And then also BI capacities. Certain organizations already have BI analysts. These are all, I think, the fundamental workforce that can be trained to get to the next level.
Great, thank you. Matt, we have a question directed to you about specific examples of bias in using AI ML in financial inclusion. And Sheila, I don't know if you want to add there. I know we talked about financial inclusion as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just yesterday, somebody introduced me to a company in Mexico. What they do is they take in data. They do a video interview and ask questions via audio of individuals getting a loan, and then they use that information with some machine learning.
We lost your audio briefly.
Like, I don't believe it. And then, well, actually, no, my first thought was like,
We're not able to hear your audio, Sheila.
America is completely illegal because it would just be like a racist filter. And yeah, I think there are great potentials on both sides, both eliminating bias and increasing bias can happen via more data. And I think it's like, up to the user how it's used. But
Okay. I wasn't able to hear the last thing. I think we lost your connection briefly. Matt, it seems like you also want to say something.
Yeah. So I think there are really kind of two main places where bias can enter in. One of them is in the data being collected and feeding into the system. So this can mean, if you collect only data around who's already been accepted for loans, then you're missing out on the rest of the population. Yeah. You're not getting a representative sample. So that's one aspect. And this can be essentially mitigated or avoided by, again, descriptive analytics, making sure that there's balanced classes, that gender and ethnicity and location are balanced or weighted in a way that reduces that bias and at least acknowledged. And the second place that bias can enter in is not necessarily always as obvious, but essentially in introducing heuristics, in introducing a company's own experience into a model prematurely. So for instance, if I select all of my friends as pilot participants for getting access to a loan, or for scanning products that are in my shop or predicting prices in my shop, I'm likely introducing bias by just simply saying this is the type of shop that we want to work with first. A better approach is to simply go out and put the product into kind of a random sample of target market or target users and collect that data, and then from that data begin to make decisions rather than from internal heuristics. So I think that these are, again, two areas where bias can be introduced and should be mitigated.
Great. So we're coming up at the end of the hour. I want to take a quick poll of the audience to see your thinking after hearing the perspective and getting the material from the report. So let me just share that with our attendees and see where your mind is at after.
I still like the robots one. It's just irresistible.
Hey, you're biasing the sample.
I am biased. I like robots. So.
Okay, we'll just give it a few more seconds.
When we're waiting, Jen, one of the things you mentioned earlier, the area, I think fraud detection is another area. I think we did not mention that one earlier.
Great, thank you. Let me move on. We're up on the hour, so let me share this with everyone. We had pretty strong response towards augmentation, and still automation, and also people seeing AI is powerful. So it's interesting to see how some of the thinking might have shifted. And hopefully this is a good prompt for you to explore AI further for your organization as an FSP or other type. Please come and access the report at fiberproject.org, where we cover the topics in more depth that you've heard Matt talk about today. And I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Andrea, Xian, Sheil, and Matt for joining us on this conversation. And I hope it continues to be a conversation. Please let us know via Twitter, via our website, what you're experiencing and your experiences and benefits from AI have been. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you,
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.